On a cold, damp island in the middle of the Atlantic, in the spring of 1922, a young woman kneels beside a narrow bed and watches her husband die. He is 34 years old. Outside, the wind off the ocean rattles the windows of a borrowed villa that is never quite warm. She is 29. She has 7 children asleep under that same leaking roof, and an 8th child growing inside her that this man will never see. And as he slips away, she makes a silent vow that she will keep, without a single day's exception, for the next 67 years. Only a few years before, she had been one of the most exalted women alive. She had been Empress of Austria. She had been Queen of Hungary. She had worn a crown that reached back 600 years to the very heart of the Holy Roman Empire, and she had ridden through cheering streets in a coach of gold. So how does the last empress of a 1,000-year dynasty end up here, penniless, pregnant and widowed, on a rain-swept rock in the ocean, exiled by the great powers of Europe to a place from which she can never threaten anyone again? Her name was Zita of Bourbon-Parma. In the next 50 minutes, you will discover the secret peace she and her husband risked everything to make in the middle of the Great War. You will discover how she raised 8 imperial children, heirs to a throne that no longer existed, through decades of poverty, flight, and the shadow of the Nazis, one of whom Hitler himself marked for death. And you will discover why, from the moment her husband died, this woman put on a black dress and never once took it off for the rest of her long, extraordinary life. Because this is not, in the end, a story about the fall of an empire. It is a story about a mother and what she chose to build out of the ruins when everything else had been taken away. And it begins, far from any battlefield, among the olive groves of the Italian coast, in the year 1892. She was born on the 9th of May, 1892, at the Villa Pianore, a rambling estate set among cypress trees near the Italian coast. She was the 17th child of Robert I, the deposed Duke of Parma, and the world she entered was one of quiet paradox. A princess born into a family that no longer possessed a throne, yet raised in a household that still behaved exactly as though it did. Her father had once ruled a small duchy in northern Italy, until it was swallowed by the new Kingdom of Italy while he was still a boy. Stripped of his crown, Robert kept his immense fortune, his sense of dynastic duty, and an unshakable belief that the old order of Europe would one day be restored. He fathered 24 children across 2 marriages, and every one of them was raised to understand that they belonged to something far larger than themselves. The Villa Pianore was not a place of bitterness, it was a place of waiting. The children studied languages and history and religion. They learned the etiquette of courts they had never once visited. They were taught that exile was not an ending, but merely an interlude, and for young Zita, childhood was shaped less by the politics of lost thrones than by the rhythms of a deeply Catholic family. Mass was said daily. The liturgical calendar ordered the seasons. Charity toward the poor of the surrounding villages was treated not as a kindness, but as a duty. Her mother impressed upon her daughters that the true measure of a princess was not the size of her dowry, but the depth of her faith. The family moved constantly, as the households of deposed rulers so often did. A season in Italy, a visit to Austria, long stretches in France, traveling always as a small court unto themselves, with tutors and governesses and priests. Zita grew up speaking Italian, French, and German with equal ease. By adolescence, she had a reputation as a serious and unusually intelligent young woman, more drawn to questions of theology than to the frivolities of society. She was not a conventional beauty, but people remembered her calm dignity and the directness of her gaze, something still and watchful about her, as though she had already decided that life was not a game. When her father died in 1907, she was 15, and the loss only deepened her devotion to her mother and to her church. Those years had quietly made her what she would need to become. The Bourbon-Parmas travelled as a small court unto themselves, a caravan of tutors and governesses and priests moving between houses in Italy, Austria, and France, and Zita absorbed all of it. The 3 languages she spoke without accent, the tangled history of the great Catholic dynasties from which she sprang, the unspoken certainty that she carried a name older and heavier than any single life. Her mother, a woman of formidable piety and quiet iron will, taught her daughters that faith was not an ornament but the very ground beneath their feet, that charity toward the poor of the villages was a debt owed, not a favor given, and that a princess without a throne was still bound by every duty of one. It was a strange schooling for the modern century rushing toward her, a girl raised in the etiquette of vanished courts and the certainty that the eternal things would outlast every upheaval. She would come to need every ounce of it. She was 19, in the summer of 1911, when she travelled to an Austrian spa town to visit her grandmother, and there she met a young cavalry officer named Archduke Karl of Austria. He was 23, a grandnephew of the ancient Emperor Franz Joseph, a gentle young man of sincere manner and, at that moment, modest prospects, one of a great crowd of archdukes with no expectation whatever of ever wearing the crown. But he was struck by Zita at once. He saw in her something steady, something that answered his own quiet seriousness. The courtship was brief and heartfelt. He proposed, she accepted, and on the 21st of October 1911, they were married at Schwarzau Castle, south of Vienna. It was a grand affair, the whole world of European royalty assembled to look on with approval, the aged emperor himself making the long journey to honor his grand-nephew, Zita, in white satin with a veil of old lace, Karl in the white uniform of his regiment. The newspapers of the day described the young couple as sincere, unaffected, devoted, and for once the newspapers were right. They settled into a quiet, happy life in a garrison town, where Karl served with his regiment. Zita had married a man she genuinely loved and entered a world that, for all its formality, felt like home. Their first child, Otto, was born on the 20th of November 1912, a healthy boy greeted with real joy across the empire. A daughter, Adelheid, followed early in 1914. The young family was growing, and the future seemed secure. But what was gathering beyond those palace walls would sweep that security away entirely. The Europe into which Otto and Adelheid were born was a continent balanced on the very edge of catastrophe. The great dynasties, the Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs, still sat on their thrones, but beneath them the ground was already shifting. On the 28th of June 1914, the spark came. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne and Karl's own uncle, was assassinated in Sarajevo. And in a single stroke, Karl, a young father of 2 who had never expected any of it, became the direct heir to an empire of 52 million people. Within weeks, the alliances of Europe collapsed into war like a row of falling dominoes. The First World War had begun, and the old world Zita had known was swept away in a storm of steel and fire. Karl was now heir to an empire at war, thrust into uniform and into the public eye, while Zita, pregnant with their 3rd child, watched her husband take up a burden he had never wanted. Their son Robert was born in February of 1915, in the middle of the conflict. And as the war ground on, year after year, devouring millions of lives, Karl served at the front and saw its horror with his own eyes. In his letters home, you can trace a young man hardening into a statesman, a man becoming convinced that this war was a catastrophe that had to be ended, not for the sake of victory, but simply for the sake of survival. Zita shared that conviction utterly. She was no conventional politician, but she was a woman of piercing moral clarity, and she believed the slaughter was a sin, and that her husband's sacred duty was to seek peace, whatever it cost him. Their fourth child, Felix, arrived in the spring of 1916. And then, on the 21st of November 1916, the ancient emperor Franz Joseph died, after a reign of 68 years. At a stroke, Karl, at 29, became Emperor Karl I of Austria and King Charles IV of Hungary. Zita, at just 24, became Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary, the last woman who would ever hold those titles, though she could not have known it then. Their coronation in Budapest, at the end of that year, was a ceremony of breathtaking splendor. They rode through the streets in a gilded coach, past vast cheering crowds and the pealing of every bell in the city. In the great church, the ancient ritual of the Hungarian kingdom was enacted around them, Karl bearing the 1,000-year-old crown of St. Stephen, Zita robed beside him. For a few hours, amid the incense and the gold, it was almost possible to believe the old world still held. It was, in truth, the last great pageant of a dying empire, the final performance of a ritual 1,000 years in the making. But the truth was grim. The empire was exhausted, its armies stretched to breaking, its cities hungry, and its new young emperor was determined, above all else, to find a way out of the war. What he did next would shape the rest of their lives. Karl began, in absolute secrecy, to explore a negotiated peace. The difficulty was enormous. Austria-Hungary was chained to Germany by treaty and by military necessity, and any move toward peace would have to be made through a channel Germany could not see. Zita's own family provided exactly such a channel. Two of her brothers, Prince Sixtus and Prince Xavier of Bourbon-Parma, were serving in the Belgian army, fighting against the Central Powers. Through them, Karl reached out toward France. In the spring of 1917, Prince Sixtus came to Vienna in secret, met with the Emperor and Empress, and left carrying a handwritten letter in which Karl pledged to support France's claim to Alsace-Lorraine, the provinces Germany had seized in 1871. It was a staggering concession, one that would have enraged Berlin if it were ever known, a reigning emperor of the Central Powers secretly siding, in writing, with the enemy's most cherished demand, in the desperate hope of ending the slaughter before it consumed his empire entirely. It became the heart of what history remembers as the Sixtus Affair. It was a gamble of breathtaking courage and breathtaking risk, and Zita was at the center of it, for it was her blood, her brothers, her family's web across the courts of Europe that had made the secret channel possible at all. If it had succeeded, it might have changed the course of the century. Instead, it would very nearly destroy them. For a time, it seemed peace might truly be possible. The French were intrigued, the British cautiously receptive. But the negotiations foundered. Germany tightened its grip on its wavering ally, and Karl, caught between his longing for peace and the iron reality of his obligations, could find no way through. And then, in the spring of 1918, the secret broke. The French, frustrated, made the letters public. The scandal was immense. Karl was accused of treachery by his own German allies and forced into a humiliating public denial, swearing loyalty to Germany, denying he had ever offered to cede an inch of territory. It was a lie, and he knew it was a lie, and the weight of it pressed down on him like a stone. Zita watched her husband suffer, the sleeplessness, the strain in his face, the quiet desperation of a man trying to save an empire that no longer wished to be saved. Their fifth child, Karl Ludwig, was born in the middle of that crisis, and it was a hard birth that left Zita ill for some time after. And now the empire itself began to come apart in their hands. Along every national fault line, Czech, Slovak, Polish, Serb, Croat, Romanian, the old unity that had held for centuries was dissolving into demands for independence. In October of 1918, the provinces broke away one after another. On the 11th of November, the war ended. Karl, who never formally abdicated, was pressed to sign a proclamation renouncing all participation in the affairs of state, and withdrew to the palace of Schönbrunn, a ghost wandering his own capital. For weeks, the family lived in a strange, suspended limbo inside a capital that had turned against them. The armies had simply melted away, the soldiers walking home from the fronts. The bureaucracy of a 1,000-year state had dissolved almost overnight. The crowds that had once cheered him now looked on with suspicion, even hatred. The great rooms of Schönbrunn grew cold and half-empty, the corridors silent, and the imperial children played where emperors had once held court, too young to grasp that the world they had been born to command had ceased, in a matter of days, to exist. Zita moved through those rooms with her composure intact and her heart breaking, tending her children, steadying her husband, and preparing, though she would not yet say the word aloud, for exile. In March of 1919, the family boarded a train and left Austria for Switzerland, quietly, without ceremony. Zita would later call it the saddest journey of her life, watching the mountains recede and knowing she would never see them again as empress. The exile had begun. They came to rest, at first, in a modest villa in the Swiss countryside, a family that had ruled 50 million souls, now crowded into a few rented rooms, watched over by the wary police of a nervous republic. The contrast was almost beyond comprehension. Only 3 years earlier, Zita had worn the crown of St. Stephen, and now she darned her children's stockings by lamplight and stretched a small allowance across a large and growing family. And yet those who met her in those first months of exile remarked again and again on the very same thing. She did not seem defeated. She was courteous, composed, entirely without self-pity, as though she had merely exchanged one set of duties for another, and in a sense she had. The duty of an empress had been to embody an empire before the world. The duty that remained to her now was harder and far more intimate, to hold a family together as the ground kept opening beneath it, and to that duty she brought the very same absolute seriousness she had once brought to a throne. But Karl would not surrender the dream. He believed the Hungarian people, with their deep attachment to the monarchy, would welcome him back, and in 1921 he made 2 desperate attempts to reclaim the Hungarian throne. The first, in the spring, was almost a fantasy. He slipped into Budapest, hoping to present the regent, Admiral Horthy, with an accomplished fact, only to be turned away and sent back to Switzerland in humiliation. The second attempt, that October, was deadly serious. Karl and Zita flew into Hungary in a small aircraft, landing in the countryside, and for a few electric days, as loyalist troops rallied to them and they marched toward Budapest, it seemed a restoration might actually succeed. But the great powers of Europe had made it unmistakably clear that they would never tolerate a Habsburg back on a throne. Hungary's neighbors threatened war. The loyalist advance was blocked. Karl and Zita were captured. And this time, the dream was truly over. Through both of those reckless, doomed adventures, Zita had been at her husband's side. She had feared for his safety with every mile, and yet she had never counseled him to abandon what he believed to be his sacred duty. That was the paradox at the center of their marriage. She was the most practical of women, clear-eyed about the world as it truly was, and yet she had bound her life to a man on an impossible quest, and she would not be the one to talk him out of his honor. When the second attempt failed, they both understood that a door had closed forever. There would be no throne, there would be no return. Whatever life remained to them would be lived entirely in exile, and it would be shorter, for one of them, than either could have guessed. Now the Allied powers resolved that this family could never again be allowed near the borders of the old empire. They chose the most remote place they could reach, Madeira, a lonely Portuguese island far out in the Atlantic. In November of 1921, the family was carried there and installed in a villa on a damp hillside above the town of Funchal. The climate was mild, but the wet crept into everything, and the house was cold and poorly heated. Karl, worn down by years of stress and defeat, fell ill almost at once, a cold that sank into bronchitis and then into pneumonia. Their resources were nearly gone. Zita nursed him herself, though she was pregnant with their 8th child and utterly exhausted, refusing to leave his side through the long, cold nights while the sea wind battered the windows. There was little money now for doctors and less for warmth. The family that had once commanded the resources of an empire could barely heat a rented villa. And the children looked on, 7 of them, frightened and bewildered, having lost their home, their country, their titles, and now watching their father, the gentle man who told them stories and loved his music, burn with fever and struggle for each breath. For Karl, in his final days, spoke not of thrones or restorations, but of God, and of his wife, and of the children he was leaving behind. He offered his suffering up, as he had been taught, for the peace of his peoples. On the 1st of April 1922, Karl died. He was 34 years old. His last words to Zita were of his love for her and a plea that she care for their children, and so there she was, 29 years old, a widow, an exile, the mother of 7 children with an 8th on the way, alone on a rock in the ocean, surrounded by a world that had no use for her at all. They buried Karl in a small church high above Funchal, and Zita stood at the graveside in black, her children gathered around her. From that day on, she wore black, and for the rest of her life, 67 years, she would never wear any other color. It was a statement and a vow and a wound that never closed. She never remarried, she never sought another life. She gave herself, wholly and without reservation, to her children and to her faith. She was 29 years old. By the measure of years, most of her life still lay ahead of her, and she chose, on that windswept hillside above the sea, to live every remaining day of it as a widow. There would be no second marriage, though she was young and free to take one. There would be no quiet retreat into private grief, though she had earned it 100 times over. Instead, she gathered her children around her like a general rallying a shattered army, and she set herself a single, impossible task: to carry all 8 of them, fatherless, stateless, and penniless, into adulthood, and to make of them something that no revolution and no empire and no dictator could ever take away. The black dress was only the outward sign of an inward decision. She would not move on. She would not forget. She would carry Karl with her every single day, and out of the wreckage of everything she had lost, she would build a life of such stubborn, unbending purpose that the grief itself, in the end, became a kind of strength. Her eighth child, a daughter named Elizabeth, was born at the end of May 1922, nearly 2 months after her father's death. A healthy girl who brought a thread of light into the darkness, and yet whose very arrival underlined all that had been lost. A fatherless child, born in a foreign land, into a family stripped of everything. For their situation now was truly desperate. Austria had confiscated the Habsburg properties. Hungary had done the same. There was no home, no income, no clear future, only the charity of relatives and the generosity of sympathetic monarchists. And yet, through all of it, Zita fixed her will on a single thing. Her children would be educated, and educated superbly. She believed without a flicker of doubt that they would one day be called to lead, and she was determined they would be ready. The years that followed were years of wandering. The family moved from Madeira to Spain, settling for a time in the small Basque fishing town of Lecatio on the northern coast. This was not the arrival of royalty, it was the arrival of refugees. The villa was small and damp in winter, without a trace of the grandeur of Schönbrunn, and the children slept 2 and 3 to a room. Zita kept the household accounts herself, counting out coins for bread and coal, with the same care her ancestors had once counted out fortunes for palaces and wars. The local villagers watched with curiosity and sympathy. Here was a woman who had worn one of the oldest crowns in Europe, hanging the family's laundry on a line. But Zita saw no humiliation in it. She saw only duty. She patched her children's clothes with her own hands, grew vegetables in the garden, taught her daughters to sew and her sons to mend their own shoes. There was no shame in honest work, she told them. Work was a form of dignity. She ran that household like a small, disciplined kingdom of its own. She managed the cooking and the cleaning, and above all, the education of her children, unwilling to let a single one of them grow up ignorant of the tradition they carried, even stripped of its power. They were taught Latin and Greek, history and mathematics, music and theology, and she was, by every account, both strict and deeply loving, demanding piety and intellectual rigor, yet endlessly patient, insisting always that they had been born not to be served, but to serve. In the evenings, she wrote her letters, to relatives, to monarchist circles, to charitable societies, not to reclaim a throne, but to secure her children's future. And at night, she lay awake in the dark, listening to the breathing of her sleeping family, wondering what on earth would become of them all. Whatever the cost, she never let them see her fear. What they saw was a mother who rose before dawn for Mass and worked without complaint until the house was dark. Her faith through these years was no vague or sentimental thing, it was an iron discipline. Daily Mass whenever it was possible, the rosary, the fasts, the lives of the saints read aloud to her children. She taught them that suffering was not meaningless, that it could be offered up and transformed into something else. Without it, she once admitted, she believed she would have gone mad. And she kept Karl alive in the house, not as a portrait on a wall, but as a living presence, telling the children stories, not of an emperor, but of a man, his gentleness, his love of music, his horror of the war, his devotion to them. The younger ones, who had no memory of him, grew up certain that their father was watching over them still, from somewhere very close. In 1929, the family moved again, this time to the small town of Long Exile, outside Brussels in Belgium, drawn by good schools and a sympathetic royal family. And for the first time since they had left Austria, the children tasted something like a normal life. Otto, the eldest, enrolled at the University of Leuven to study political and social science, and was already thinking deeply about the future of Europe, about a new order that might rise above the old national hatreds. His mother encouraged his mind even where she disagreed with his conclusions. She believed in the legitimacy of the Habsburg claim, while he was coming to believe the future lay in a united Europe that might have no room for kings at all. They argued about it, sometimes fiercely, always with respect. Zita never demanded agreement from her children. She demanded thought, and that perhaps was her quiet masterpiece. She had taken 8 heirs of a fallen empire and, instead of feeding them on bitterness and the fantasy of a restoration that would never come, she had raised them to think for themselves and to make their own way in a century that had no place for their titles. And so, one by one, they became themselves. Adelheid the scholar, buried in her books. Robert, drawn toward the world of finance, with a gift for numbers that surprised even his mother. Felix toward the law. Karl Ludwig toward engineering. The quiet, watchful Rudolph toward the sciences. And the 2 youngest girls, Charlotte and Elizabeth, still children, who had never known the father whose death had shaped all their lives. Scattered though they were beginning to be, across schools and cities and callings, Zita remained the fixed point around which the whole family turned, the center of gravity, holding them together through letters and visits and the sheer force of her will. And then came 1933, and the shadow of the swastika fell across Europe. When Adolf Hitler took power in Germany, Zita understood at once what it meant. She had already watched one order collapse. She would not stand quietly by as a far more terrible one rose in its place. She spoke against the Nazis, firmly, in the circles where her voice carried, and urged her children to do the same. And it was Otto who became a particular target. The Nazis saw in him a living symbol of an alternative, non-Nazi, German-speaking identity, a rival to everything they intended. They branded him an enemy of the Reich. And when Germany swallowed Austria in the Anschluss of 1938, the code name they chose for the operation was, pointedly, Operation Otto. It was meant as an insult. It was, in truth, a recognition of a man they feared and marked for arrest and execution if ever he were caught. The Gestapo came for him more than once, and more than once he barely escaped. He had spent years crossing Europe, warning its leaders of the danger Hitler posed, calling for Austrian independence, refusing every overture from a regime he despised, and he had made himself, in the process, one of the very few men the Nazi machine genuinely feared. His mother watched all of it from Belgium, torn between fierce pride and a mother's terror. She had already buried a husband and lost an empire. Now the century's new darkness was reaching directly for her eldest son. When war broke out and the German army swept into Belgium in May of 1940, the family was caught in the chaos of the invasion. Zita gathered her children and whatever they could carry and joined the vast, terrified flood of refugees pouring south. The roads choked with civilians, the sky full of German planes. They fled through France, crossed into Spain, and reached Portugal, and it was a nightmare undertaken in fear and exhaustion. But Zita did not break. She held the family together, found food and shelter, negotiated with officials, prayed, and in Lisbon at last, she arranged passage on a ship bound for America. The Atlantic crossing was long and rough, and crowded with other refugees, but the family reached New York safely and traveled north to settle in Quebec, in Canada, for the duration of the war. There is something almost unbearable in the image of it. The woman who had once been crowned in the crown of St. Stephen, who had ridden through Budapest in a coach of gold, now shepherding her children down roads clogged with terrified refugees, sleeping where she could, bargaining for passage in port after port, with nothing left of empire but the family walking beside her. And yet this was, in a sense, the truest measure of who she had always been. Stripped of every title, every palace, every guard, she was revealed as what she had been all along, not a symbol, but a mother, and an unbreakable one. Those North American years were years of waiting. The children, mostly grown now, went their separate ways, some serving in the Allied forces, others pursuing their careers. Otto spent the war in the United States, working with the American government, pleading Austria's cause, arguing for a post-war world that would respect the rights of small nations. And Zita lived quietly, praying, writing, following the war on the radio and in the papers, knowing her homeland was suffering, its cities bombed, its people crushed, and that she could do nothing for them now but pray. And so she prayed. She had learned across a lifetime of loss that prayer was not a retreat from the world, but the one form of action left to her when every other had been taken away. The war ended in 1945, and the world that emerged was exhausted and transformed. The old empires gone, Europe in ruins, a bitter new division falling across the continent. Austria would not regain full independence until 1955, and the Habsburgs remained banned from their homeland. It was a hard blow, especially for Otto, who had given the war years to Austria's cause and hoped the family might be allowed home. But the ban held. Zita accepted it, as she had accepted so much else, without railing against the injustice. She simply waited, and she went on wearing black, that black dress that had become, over the decades, a kind of uniform, a silent statement that she had loved once and would not love again, that she had lost everything and would not pretend otherwise. In the years after the war, Zita settled at last in the small Swiss town of Zizas, in a simple, almost austere house with a chapel, a library, and a small garden, and her life narrowed to prayer, correspondence, and family. Her children and grandchildren came often. Her grandchildren would remember a small, dignified woman with bright, sharp eyes and a firm voice, who always had time for them, who listened carefully and answered thoughtfully, who taught them their history and their faith without ever once making them feel the weight of it. There was a chapel in the house, and a library, and a small garden, and her days moved to an unchanging rhythm of prayer and letters and family, the same disciplined order she had kept through every exile and every catastrophe, now grown gentle with age. The family swelled around her. There were weddings to attend and grandchildren to be baptized, and she went to all of it, the black-clad matriarch at the edge of every photograph, watching a new generation rise. The Habsburg name, once a byword for imperial power across half of Europe, had come to mean something else entirely in her hands. Not empire, but endurance. She had begun with nothing but a dead husband and 8 frightened children on a rain-soaked island in the Atlantic. She ended, more than 60 years later, as the matriarch of a sprawling dynasty of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, spread across 2 continents, a family that had lost its throne, but never for one moment its identity. In 1961, the Austrian government at last permitted Otto to return, on the condition that he renounce his claim to the throne, which he did, not out of surrender, but out of a wish to serve his homeland as an ordinary citizen. Zita watched from Switzerland, proud and moved. She herself would not set foot in Austria again until 1982, when she was 90 years old, and the visit was a sensation. The woman who had left as empress in 1919 returned as a symbol of reconciliation, received by the president, visiting the places of her youth, praying in the churches where she had prayed as a girl. The crowds who came were not monarchists demanding a restoration. They were ordinary Austrians paying their respects to a woman who embodied something they felt they had lost: continuity, dignity, and the long memory of a nation. 63 years had passed since she had watched those mountains recede from a departing train, certain she would never see them again. Now she was 90, a tiny figure in black, moving slowly through streets that still, somehow, remembered her, and the country that had banished her as a symbol of the old world welcomed her back as a symbol of survival. She wept, they say, in the churches of her youth. It was a homecoming. It was also a farewell, and she knew it. Zita died on the 14th of March 1989 at Ziza's, aged 96. She had outlived her husband by 67 years, almost to the day, and had outlived very nearly the entire world she had known as a young woman. She had seen the aeroplane and the atom bomb, the rise and fall of fascism, the division and the coming reunification of Europe. Her funeral was held in Vienna, the city she had fled in 1919, and the crowds were vast. Tens of thousands lining the streets to honor the last empress. The procession wound through the old imperial capital to the Capuchin Church and the imperial crypt, the Kapuzinergruft, where the Habsburgs have been laid for centuries. And there an ancient ritual was enacted. A herald knocked upon the closed door of the crypt and called out her long list of imperial titles. The door stayed shut. He knocked again and named the titles again. Again nothing. And then a third time the herald knocked, and this time asked admittance only for Zita, a mortal, sinful human being. And at those words, the door swung open, and she was received. In death, all earthly titles fall away. Her heart, in keeping with her wishes, was not buried with her body, but laid at Muri Abbey in Switzerland, beside the heart of the man she had loved, a final closing of the circle. And 15 years later, in 2004, came the vindication she had worked toward almost from the day Karl died. From that first year of her widowhood, she had gathered the documents, preserved the letters, testified to his character, insisting that the world remember him not as a failed ruler, but as a man of peace. And in 2004, after decades of investigation, the Catholic Church declared him Blessed Karl of Austria, the emperor who sought peace. She had believed in her husband when the whole world had written him off, and she had been proven right. So what, in the end, was the secret fate of her 8 children? It was, quite simply, that they survived. Heirs to a throne that had vanished, marked men and women in a century of dictators, they lived, and not merely lived, but flourished. They became scholars and bankers, lawyers and engineers, and, in Otto's case, one of the great architects of a united Europe, who sat for decades in its parliament and lived until 2011 to the age of 98, a witness to nearly the whole of the 20th century. They served the continent in ways their imperial ancestors could never have dreamed. And nearly all of them lived long, full lives, as though their mother's sheer endurance had been passed down in the blood. Adelheid, the scholar, the first to go, in 1971. Robert, who died in 1996. Carl Ludwig in 2007. Rudolf in 2010. Felix, like his eldest brother Otto, living all the way to 2011. Charlotte died in 1989, the very same year as her mother, and Elizabeth, the posthumous child, the daughter who had never seen her father's face, lived until 1993. Between them, They had spanned nearly the entire 20th century, born to an empire, raised in exile, and carried, by the woman in black, all the way into the modern world. And they did it all in the shadow of a mother who never once stopped being an empress, not of a country, but of a family. She ruled that family with love and iron discipline. She ruled her own grief with a terrible grace, and she ruled her husband's memory with a fidelity that outlasted every empire and every enemy. She was not, in the end, the last of anything. The empire she briefly wore is gone. The thrones are empty. The palaces are museums. The titles are dust. But the fidelity remains, in the lives of her descendants, in the beatification of her husband, in the memory of a black-clad figure who stood at a graveside on Madeira and made a promise she kept for 67 years. She had transformed grief into purpose, exile into a kind of home, and a private sorrow into a light that still burns in the quiet places of the world. History tried to bury her along with the empire. It did not succeed. She was Zita of Bourbon-Parma, the last Empress of Austria, the widow in black, the mother of 8, and hers is a story that deserves to be remembered. If the story of Zita moved you, then you must hear about the other tragic Empress of Austria, Elizabeth, the woman the world called Sisi, the most beautiful princess in Europe, worshipped and imprisoned by her own crown, who lost her son to a scandal that has never fully been explained, and who met her own end at the point of an assassin's blade on a lake shore in Geneva. Subscribe now, so you never miss these forgotten women of history, because we publish a new one every single week.